afternoon. Thanks to the organisers for inviting me here. So just to begin with a question that will be quite relevant throughout this talk, who is familiar here with the website Reddit, just by a show of hands? Good. Okay. Just for anyone, the few who aren't aware, Reddit is basically a huge forum aggregator. It looks something like this, and it's divided up into what are called subreddits, and these have different topics. So, for instance, there is a subreddit called Perfect Fit, which is for users to post pictures of objects that they've managed to fit perfectly into a space, like a book into the perfectly sized space on a bookshelf. There are various other subreddits for all sorts of things. Not only are they divided up by topic, they're also divided up by the style of conversation. Some subreddits encourage you to post pictures, others encourage you to post your thoughts, and others encourage you to, say, ask questions. Now, I don't want to focus entirely on Reddit today. I want to use Reddit as a very, very good and very, very large example of what are known as Web 2.0 sites. So Web 2.0 refers to websites which encourage, through their design, users not just to read the content, but also to get involved, to comment, to have a conversation, to talk to other users. Reddit is an example of that. Twitter, Facebook, Wikipedia even. Now, Web 2.0 sites are excellent for researchers like myself who are interested in the internet and interested in getting natural data of how people talk, because you get to see conversations between huge numbers of people happening in real time and also being saved, sometimes slightly creepily, for all posterity. They are a fantastic source of data. They're also, and this isn't so much my interest, but it may be for some of you here, they're also a really interesting resource for science communicators. Because as you can imagine, these sorts of websites allow people to have conversations in large numbers where previously they might only have been able to read Scientific American or watch Brian Cox. So Reddit is again an example of that. I've put up an example of one science-themed subreddit. It's called Science. Fairly straightforward, and you possibly can't see, it's a bit blurry, but basically what this site does is people post up-to-date and often really quite advanced research papers, and other people can comment on them. So with, again, you probably can't see, but there's 1.5 million subscribers to this. This is almost certainly the largest audience that a paper on, I don't know, rat fall-limb grown in the lab, for instance, is ever going to receive. And that's actually probably a bad example. There are some very, very niche and specific and advanced scientific research papers published here. Another science-themed subreddit, as I said, on a different sort of style of conversation, is called Ask Science. People can post their science questions, such as what is the lowest pressure a sound wave requires to travel, and people with more expertise can answer. Now, I'm going to, as my title of my talk suggests, talk about a slightly more niche use of Web 2.0, and that I'm going to exemplify using this subreddit, which, with apologies for the swearing, is called Shitty Ask Science, and is a parody of Ask Science, but the questions, as you can see, are not quite serious in their intent. Now, some of these questions do require a little bit of basic scientific knowledge to get the joke. Others parody the sort of scientific style of argumentation, or, as we can see from the last one, perhaps parody the image of scientific conversations in popular media. However, a great many of these, I'll call them jokes, actually don't really refer to science much at all. So these top two refer to just sort of cultural references. So I popped a can of Pringles and the fun won't stop is an advertising slogan. Does the 5-second rule, that's where you drop some food, and if it's on the floor for less than 5 seconds, it's still okay to eat, not 5 minutes, even though I'm not that desperate as a PhD student. And that one at the bottom is just a simple joke about grammar, essentially. And these are the most popular jokes on the website, on Shitty Ask Science, of all time. So the point I want to start with is that when we talk about science comedy and science jokes, even on science-themed websites, it is not de facto appropriate to necessarily say there is something, an inherent link between science and comedy. Often the idea of the jokes can go well away from the ideas of the science. However, What I do want to argue today is that even though there's a complicated and very hard to pin down relationship, maybe no relationship, between science and comedy, there's a much clearer relationship between what we might say about the comedy and the infrastructure of the website. And I'm going to talk about different examples to show different websites and how their infrastructure is built in such a way to facilitate different sorts of jokes and to discourage others. I'm going to talk again, with apologies for the strong language. There's an awful lot of rudeness on the internet and it's sometimes quite hard to get away from. The Facebook group I Fucking Love Science. I'm going to talk about the more serious Reddit science threads, and then I'm going to talk about some responses to both. As I say, the point of this talk really is to show that different websites have different attitudes towards science and jokes, and it's not necessarily about whether jokes are good at communicating science, it's about whether certain websites are appropriate for using certain kinds of jokes. Now, this is Facebook. This is IFLS, I Fucking Love Science. In case anyone's wondering why there's big white spaces, I've blanked out the names of users, just for ethical reasons. But as you can see, this is a Facebook thread for anyone who knows about Facebook. And IFLS was created in 2012 by an undergraduate called Elise Andrew in England. It was, in her own words, only supposed to be a page for her to share some jokes with a few friends. Within a day, it had 1,000 likes, that's a lot, and by now it has 20 million. By contrast, the Facebook page for Fox News has 10 million. So this is, as far as Facebook goes, twice as large as Fox News. That's quite an impressive achievement. And Elise Andrew herself ascribes this success to what she calls, and I've used in my title, the mix of humour and intelligence. So what does that look like? Well, as you can see, it's posting something about SpaceX unveiling its new spacecraft design. That's up-to-the-date topical scientific news. And then underneath a joke about Freddie Mercury with the chemical symbol for Mercury dressed like the singer Freddie Mercury. It's a joke, etc. Now, how do jokes work to facilitate this mix of humour and intelligence and popularity? So sorry if this is patronising anyone, but I do just want to go through how Facebook works in some detail. Some of you are obviously familiar with Facebook, others may not be, but also, even if you're familiar with Facebook, it's sometimes good to take a step back, I find anyway, for research purposes, and think again about how it actually works on a more technical level. So let's imagine this is my newsfeed. It's got posts from my friends, it's got posts from sites I follow. And one of my friends likes a post made by IFLS, or perhaps tags my name in it, so I see it, or shares it. It appears on my timeline. I become aware of IFLS. I think they're a fun page. I like the page. Suddenly, loads of their posts start appearing in my newsfeed. I like or tag someone in one of those, or I share one of those. Another user ends up in the same cycle that I've had. Okay, so the idea is, if you want to get a page popular, you need to get the posts being shared and tagged and liked. Because this is the Facebook page for IFLS. Next to no one will actually necessarily go to the actual Facebook page. Most people will just use their home feed. They won't go here. They'll just see the posts appearing in their own newsfeed. So, this is a bit of a messy graph. There's a better one coming up, I promise. But I don't know if you can see, basically, the y-axis is the total number of comments and replies put on posts that I took from IFLS in the month of March this year, and that's on the x-axis, the total number of likes achieved by each post. And I've labelled each post with a single word just to give a sense of what topic they're about. You can see that things like controversial issues, homeopathy, vaccination, climate change, they get quite a lot of people commenting on them, having a conversation of sorts on them. Whereas along the ones who are getting lots of likes but not many comments and replies, there's a lot of posts about women. That's because it was International Women's Day and they made posts about women in science, but also a lot that are just labelled funny or cool image. A clearer graph is the number of tagged names, which basically says to a friend, hey, look at this post, I think you'll like it, versus the average number of words used to comment on a post. And that's a much clearer relationship. As you can see at the top, the posts labelled funny achieve an average of about 1 word, maybe less, but loads of tags, well, average of about 2 tags. On the average message length, the ones labelled skeptical, vaccination, social issues, climate change, next to no one gets tagged, but the word count is much higher because people are having, as I say, something resembling a conversation. Now, my theory, and there is more to be said about this, is that because you are, these posts at the sort of the left-hand side of the graph are making people aware of IFLS. They're doing that thing I showed you of creating a cycle where more and more people join. The ones down the right are the people who have joining in the conversation. So maybe this mixture of humour and intelligence is facilitating the use of this site as a tool for spreading science news. Whether it's a good one is a much more controversial issue, which I'm happy to talk about in questions, but I won't now. What I do want to talk about is why, on these funny posts, the average comment count is like 1 word or less. And that's because a lot of people are not actually writing any comments, they're just leaving pictures like this in the comments threads. As with Shitty Ask Science, you can see some of them are vaguely attempting to be scientific. A lot of them obviously aren't. A lot of them are just comments on the internet or downright insults. So while the humorous side of science that IFLS is so keen to promote might be bringing people to the website, I think from just this collection you can see they're not necessarily encouraging people to join in the conversation. Look, son, an idiot is quite a common one, and that one down there, meanwhile, in the comments section, shows the sorts of fights that often go on below the posts in IFLS. So it's not it might be a good way of getting news out. It's not necessarily a great way of, as we saw earlier with I can't remember which climate change film it was, but the ones that are quite mocking, climate change films that are quite mocking, are potentially preaching to the converted and not bringing new people in to the conversation. So we'll leave Facebook for now and move on to Reddit. So I showed you this earlier. This is Ask Science. Now, on pretty much all of the scientific subreddits, and there's a few, there's a series of rules that say things about what sort of comments are allowed, and you've got the standard things of like don't insult people, don't be racist, don't incite violence, but also on the scientific subreddits you get an awful lot of rules saying don't make jokes, jokes aren't okay, meme images aren't okay. What does this bit here mean? Downvote, anecdotes, speculation and jokes. So again, that's just to exemplify it further, the internet is serious business, okay? Not science. They're not saying science is serious business, they're saying the internet is serious business. So, what does downvoting and upvoting mean? Again, apologies if you know Reddit inside out, but just to explain, this might be my Reddit page. There's a little post from Our Science there. I upvote it, and it gets moved higher and higher up the feed. Any post that's at the top of the feed is much more likely to be read by other people because people really can't be bothered scrolling down loads and loads and loads. So if Reddit worked like IFLS does and we saw those funny posts getting all those likes, like many, many, many more likes than the not funny posts, what would happen is all of the funny posts would end up at the top and it would just completely clog up the newsfeed and no one would bother to read the site. And that, you know, people do worry about that. People discuss on Reddit when people say, can we have jokes? We should be allowed to have jokes in these science subreddits. Jokes are good for discussing science. They say, no, because it just makes the conversation impossible to follow. And this is something you see in what are called meta threads, which, by the way, if you're a social scientist looking at the internet, meta threads on Reddit are an absolutely great place to look because it's people basically just reflecting on how they use the internet. It's a fantastic source of data that I think is hugely underused. Anyway, so I hope I've made the point that there is something going on with infrastructure between these sites. The attitudes to jokes and science are perhaps more shaped by how these sites are working and what they're trying to do. But I want to end in a sort of three-part structure by complicating the picture particularly, because I'm a social scientist and I have to, it's in the job description, and talk about some of the responses to these websites. So, responses to our Ask Science, Our Science, these scientific subreddits are really hard to find, really surprisingly hard to find, even using the power of Google. This is one of the few things I've been able to find which basically says Our Science has got really, really complicated explanations in it and I can't follow them. And that is a complaint that's made a few times, but the response to that is often, well, there's nowhere else. There's, you know, Facebook doesn't have something similar. If you want, you know, easy science, go to Brian Cox or Carl Sagan, well, maybe not Carl Sagan now, but Neil deGrasse Tyson. And Reddit basically claims we're a place for the experts. Again, a debate I'm happy to address, but I won't address particularly now. Responses to IFLS are much easier to find and much clearer. They are often pretty brutal. So this is the blogger Maddox, who wrote a blog post on his page, The Best Page in the Universe, so you can see the sort of person we're talking about here, where he said that what IFLS was doing was not promoting science, it was promoting pseudoscience and jokes under the guise of science. Oh, and thinly veiled political speculation as well. He's a nice man. And what he does very interestingly, for the purposes of this talk, is he compares not science, jokes, to actual science, and says that what's happening is people are liking the jokes and not the actual science. Again, you know, who's to decide what is and isn't actual science? Well, Maddox clearly thinks he is. As a response to this, he also made the page I fucking hate, I fucking love science, which in a similar way to Shitty Ass Science just posts humorous content, usually sarcastic captions applied to memes that IFLS has shown. Although maybe not. There's a little trick here. Anyone who's seen this presentation before, don't tell people the answer. There is a little thing that is subtle but worth noting on some of these pictures. Can anyone see what it is? No? Okay. I've shown you 3 pictures from I Fucking Hate, I Fucking Love Science, which is supposedly making out that IFLS is a really, really terrible site. Only one of the 3 is actually from IFLS. The other 2 are from other websites. So what it's doing is attacking an image of science that it thinks IFLS represents. It's actually, because I had to do it for this talk, quite hard to find funny content posted by IFLS nowadays, because they are kind of more aware of how they're being perceived as a not very serious outlet, I suspect. So maybe jokes on these sorts of combative sites are quite good, not to necessarily... they're not necessarily saying what is and isn't science, obviously, but they're starting to give the analyst a picture of an image of science that the creator of these sorts of parody sites wants to attack. And it's actually less important to get the right site than it is to get the right image. There's also a very funny site actually called I Fucking Hate Science, which is direct parody of IFLS. And a lot of their posts are literally just images of like the natural world, so things like rocks, etc. And unfortunately, I can't show you comments threads again because of ethical issues, but there's a very fun comment down on this particular picture somewhere that someone says, this is actually really interesting. I saw a documentary about how rain causes desert sands to shift and rocks roll along as a result, and someone else comments underneath going, whoa, that's far too much science for this site, buddy. What's next? Evolution and global warming? And that's a fairly common recurring theme throughout this site. My personal favourite is this one, which again just posts various scientific-y images and says slightly silly things about them. Again, the joke is, even though they're not directly parodying IFLS, it's saying, here's things that look kind of sciencey. We're all going to agree they look kind of sciencey. So it's funny that I'm appending something so facetious on top of it. So I'm actually ending by... complicating the point I started with. I started by saying that we can't necessarily see a direct link between science and jokes, and I'd still stand by that, but I would also say that what these more combative parody sites do is they show us a sort of image that some people, for the purposes of humour or for the purposes of trying to attack certain sites, construct around science, and that it is useful to be able to have this recognisable image of science that they claim everyone shares in order to make their jokes. But, and here's the caveat, there is a further purpose behind those jokes, often, you know, to attack sites like IFLS. I'm happy to draw that out in more detail if it wasn't clear. But for the purposes of this conference and for finishing off, I thought I'd just ask some big questions about science and popular culture and entertainment media, in particular the idea that Web 2.0 might be a fantastic resource for helping people to communicate science, spread science to huge numbers of people. Think of the 20 million likes IFLS has. Think of the 1.5 million subscribers our science has. And on the other hand, it can also work to create a place, comments, threads, which scare people, intimidate people, and preach to the converted. So we don't necessarily want to be utopian about it. We don't necessarily want to be dystopian about it. But what we do want to do is use evidence and data. Unfortunately, there's a heck of a lot of it. So yeah, happy to take more questions or indeed just tell you more jokes from the internet. Thank you.